Thank you to Jeff, and welcome back to what I'm sure promises to be a really exciting year of talks here at the Kinder Institute up on the 4th floor of Jesse Hall. I am excited to be back for a second straight year, and I am equally as excited to get the chance to introduce my good friend, Dr. Lauren MacIvor Thompson, to give the inaugural talk this year. Dr. Thompson is a historian of reproductive health, women's rights, and the law, and she is an assistant professor of history and interdisciplinary studies at Kennesaw State University. She also serves as a faculty fellow at the Georgia State University College of Law Center for Law, Health, and Society. She does have a book that will be forthcoming in 2024 with Rutgers University Press. The title of that forthcoming volume is Rivals and Rights: Mary Dennett, Margaret Sanger, and the Making of the American Birth Control Movement. So look for that in the next couple of years. Dr. Thompson has published academic articles in Law and History Review and the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And you may have seen some of her op-eds, which have appeared in such venues as the Washington Post and New York Times, among many others. Her research has been supported widely by the American Philosophical Society, the New York Academy of Medicine, the Society for the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and many others there as well. Dr. Thompson is, of course, also a frequent public speaker, and we are really burning up her dance card this year. But she kicks off a very, very busy September with us, talking both about her research and its connection to the recent Supreme Court decision. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lauren MacIvor Thompson.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay? All right, thank you, Annie, for that. Thank you all for having me here today. It is a true pleasure to be here at the Kinder Institute and to help participate in this wonderful academic mission that you all have. And I'm really honored and excited to be able to talk to you and thank you for coming on your Friday of your Labor Day weekend. I will endeavor to make this as interesting and lively as possible, since I know it is a Friday afternoon. So, and I think, today I hope we recognize just how timely this topic is, the role of physicians and the law and reform in the topics of birth control and abortion. And as Annie said, this is the part of my larger work, which I hope will be out in 2024 if all goes well. So the work, I'll just say a little bit about the book first before I kind of talk about the Dobbs case and its connection to birth control law. But the work examines the rivalry between Mary Ware Dennett and Margaret Sanger, who were two women who emerged as bitter adversaries and who had sharply competing ideals about the role of contraception in society, as well as the methods that should be used to legalize it. So as my book shows, examining the conflicting agendas of Dennett and Sanger together reveals a new angle on the history of birth control in the United States and its place within the early 20th century women's movement. In 1915, it was Mary Dennett, who's pictured on, I guess, your left, who founded the first birth control organization in the United States, 6 years before Margaret Sanger, who's pictured on the right, would establish the American Birth Control League. So unlike Sanger, Dennett, who was a suffragist, she fundamentally rejected the relationship between eugenics and birth control. And she sought instead to legalize it through via the rights of free expression, free speech, and free expression. So if we're here to talk about the Constitution, Dennett was certainly somebody who saw the role of birth control as mediated through the Constitution. It was Dennett's approach to birth control reform that pushed Sanger in new directions, and I argue forced the movement as a whole towards strategies that continue to profoundly affect today's reproductive law and policy. So the project reinterprets the standard histories of birth control and relatedly abortion in the United States, and it challenges the general understanding that Margaret Sanger was the sole leader of the movement. And so further, as they work to bring birth control into the mainstream, Dennett and Sanger's politics, their feminism, their attitudes about medicine, eugenics, and race, and their approaches to reform would forever shape and cement the way we understand reproductive control in American society. So you can probably imagine then how, for those of us who write about the histories of birth control and abortion, what May 2nd, 2022 was like. That was the day that the Dobbs decision first leaked to the media, to Politico. So while the leak was certainly a surprise, I think, for those of us who do this, the content of what the decision said was not. Of course, there are many people, not just historians, who have been expecting the fall of Roe for a very long time, but watching the fall of legalized abortion in real time and the similarly looming threat to contraception, it was like watching our research and our understanding of the historical trajectories that shaped birth control and abortion laws somehow come full circle. It certainly reiterated for this historian the fact that progress is not a linear march forward in US history, but rather a series of stops and starts, retreats and advances. And although one continues to hope that one day we can move past that, I really don't think we can overemphasize just how true this is for women in the United States, particularly women of color. Scholars of women's history know all too well that the story of women in the United States is one of incomplete gains and outright revocations over more than 3 centuries. So we are now living through a moment of outright revocation of a pre-existing right, and there are questions about what might come next. And so as a scholar of contraceptive history, I have some guesses. So indeed, very quickly it became clear to those watching the news that birth control and abortion are not separate histories, and they remain linked social issues. You simply cannot have one without the other. In fact, in early America and all over the world, abortion, especially in the first trimester, was birth control. Part of this stemmed from the fact that not getting your period was seen as a problem to be treated. Humoral theory, the ancient belief that the body continually produces the humors, blood, bile, phlegm, and other substances, which all have to be in balance to maintain your health. That is where this stems from. So if you're sick or if your period isn't coming, it was viewed as being caused by a blockage in those humors that needed to be removed. So it was not until the 1920s, as Dennett and Sanger battled for primacy in the movement, that they began to explicitly argue that abortion would be eliminated if birth control were made legal. So in today's talk then, I'm going to discuss the nuance of that argument and their understanding of the place of abortion in American society. I'll also illustrate how the gradual medicalization of birth control and the professionalization of physicians alongside the court system were increasingly willing to recognize and elevate that authority, and how that would shape birth control and abortion access for the rest of the 20th century. So to get at these larger themes, I feel like I'm in class, talking to my students, I am going to cover 3 central events in the history of the American birth control movement that form the core of a few different chapters of my book. The first is going to be Dennett's unsuccessful fight with the New York Academy of Medicine beginning in 1920 to get doctors in that organization to support birth control. But even as physicians' reluctance stymied the movement by the mid-1930s, the birth control reform movement had become firmly connected to medical expertise. So 2 other examples shed light on that shift. First is this 1936 federal court case with the wonderful name of the United States versus one package of Japanese pessaries. Pessary is a birth control item that you use internally. It's sort of like a diaphragm. That court case freed doctors from the legal consequences of prescribing contraception. So I'll talk about that along with this 1938 public birth control program run by a physician actually who was heir to the Procter and Gamble fortune in North Carolina. So he ran this program in North Carolina in 1938. So as we'll conclude, then by the time the Supreme Court heard the case Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, that's the case that legalized birth control, the right of physicians to manage reproduction was already cemented. The Roe v. Wade case then looked at Griswold and its rulings on physicians' privacy to make a similar pronouncement about abortion. So the links between birth control, abortion, and medical practice are really key to understanding how the Dobbs decision, far from being unprecedented, which I think a lot of us felt like, oh my gosh, this is something new. Instead, I argue it echoes well over a century of developments in the realm of reproductive law and medicine. Okay, so first of all, I want to emphasize that, none of this was foreordained. It was not predestined that birth control or even abortion, even surgical methods of abortion would become the domain of physicians. It was not even certain that it would become illegal. Both of those things happened, but to understand why, we have to look at the place of contraception and abortion dating from the earliest days of the colonial period, and also the trajectory of American medical development. Before the institution of the 19th century legal regime governing abortion began, women managed their own bodies with very little interference from the state. Birth control advice and devices had long been available since the colonial period. Many of you may have heard through the media about Benjamin Franklin, including a recipe for an abortifacient in one of his advice books from the Revolutionary period. There were other books that were owned by ordinary Americans that detailed how to restore the menses, like William Buchan's Domestic Medicine, and they're both pictured here. Enslaved women and Native women had extensive knowledge of birth control, and knowledge spread among women of all races and classes. They used a variety of herbs and plants, including cottonroot or tansy or juniper, which were plants that were commonly grown here in the United States to induce abortion or to bring on their menses. And in the 19th century, information also freely circulated in manuals like Robert Dale Owen's Moral Physiology, which was published in 1831, or Dr. Edward Bliss Foote's Medical Common Sense, which was published in 1864. So trained physicians and hospitals were really not common until later in the 19th century. Americans really handled their health at home via midwives and healers, and they self-administered medicines and treatments, with women often serving as the family physician. And that was an absolute necessity, because in a world without medical technologies and advances like we have now, women constantly suffered from a variety of reproductive and childbirth-related problems, including lacerations, tears in the vaginal wall, uterus or vesicovaginal fistulas, diastasis recti, and other issues that plagued women with irritation, incontinence, pain, and even lifelong debility. So treatments for uterine or vaginal problems like infections or prolapsed or tilted uteri, dysmenorrhea, fibroids, all these issues, they included washes administered by syringe, plus pills, tampons, douches, sponges, pessaries, and suppositories, all of which were sold by druggists or mail order and designed for women to be able to use at home. They were advertised in newspapers and magazines with euphemisms like mother's friend. You can see here golden female pills, remedies for irregularity, uterine regulators, relief for ladies, all these different euphemisms were used, and they were, like I said, available from mail order catalogs to the druggist on the corner and traveling salesmen as well. Instruments were also widely available, and that included one of the things that you see here, which is this like douching tube, as well as uterine probes. So a lot of this is designed to induce menstruation. It's designed to bring down the menses. And these methods are what we call emmenagogues, or substances designed to stimulate menstrual flow. Of course, some of these items were then also simultaneously used for reproductive control, although the efficacy was mixed. We're not talking 99% certainty here. Pessaries, although designed for uterine issues, could, with the right design, also function like cervical caps or a diaphragm. Designers and manufacturers began to manufacture rubber devices that they specifically referred to as womb guards or preventative pessaries, among other names. Sponges were also very popular and were sold alongside washes and spermicides made with astringents and common household substances like vinegar and baking soda. They also often contain some of those plants that I spoke about before that had kind of long been associated with abortion, including black cohosh, savin, ergot, cottonroot, tansy. So although both women and physicians considered delayed menstruation to be a serious health issue requiring action, the abortifacient qualities of these medicines were also well known and implied in their advertising, because all of the items have both a medical and a contraceptive use or abortifacient use, and so despite that though, their advertising and their sale was just a common feature of life in the 19th and then up through the 20th century. And in fact, jumping forward into the 1920s, I can never resist showing these. By the 1920s, companies like Lysol and Zonite began to market their products, which contained Cresol, as feminine hygiene. That is code for contraception. Margaret Sanger, included a douche recipe in her book, Family Limitation, that included Lysol as a ingredient to be mixed with warm water. And she puts this recipe in a little book called Family Limitation, and it's one of the things that lands her in Blackwell Island prison in New York. And that was in the early 1920s. Surgical abortion also gained popularity in the 1840s as well. So a layperson who was well versed in being able to use instruments to puncture the uterus or remove the fetus, anybody could learn how to perform early term abortions. They used specialized perforating and forceps-like instruments, which included cranioclasts, trepans, and basiotribes, which is pictured up here in the corner. And these instruments basically reduced the cranial circumference in order to quickly remove the fetal body with the least possible trauma to the woman's body, because there were no antibiotics or transfusions, so speed would have been of the essence. So one of the most famous surgical abortionists in the country, who had a national reputation, was Madame Ristel, who ran a thriving business for over 3 decades in New York City. And she also had satellite offices in Boston and Philadelphia. She was very much an entrepreneur. Female abortionists were sometimes called female physicians, and Ristel went by that term. She taught herself how to do abortions by probing women's uteruses with a piece of whalebone. Most likely, this meant that she inserted the whalebone into the woman's cervical opening, compromising the cervical plug and causing the uterus to contract and expel the fetus. And she openly advertised her services in newspapers to, quote, married ladies whose delicate or precarious health forbids a too rapid increase of family. As you might imagine, Ristel and others who performed abortions or sold birth control and abortifacient items risked the law's consequences. The first laws, and I should pause here and say, there were no laws governing abortion at all up until 1821, when Connecticut is the first state to pass a law that basically says that you can't sell dangerous abortifacients. But that law was developed in the same universe as legislators are concerned in general about the danger of patent medicines. Anybody could make a medicine, sell it on the market. There is no FDA. So it's not even that they were directly necessarily targeting contraceptives and abortifacients. It's more that they're targeting dangerous medications in general. So they were not, those first laws in the 1820s and 1830s are really not aimed at morality. They're aimed at the risks of poisoning. And again, that's because this market is so unregulated and it's just this wild, it's literally a wild west of advertising. And further, the early laws do not criminalize abortion before quickening, which is the moment where somewhere between the 4th and the 6th month of pregnancy where you can feel fetal movement. And so these early laws really recognized that women had a basic right to bodily integrity, and they were not interested in criminalizing abortion, in the first trimester, at least. So by the middle of the 19th century, however, doctors began to urge state legislatures throughout the United States to criminalize abortion and contraceptives. So physicians like Horatio Storer and Joseph Tabor Johnson and other members of the American Medical Association, which was formed in 1847, sought to consolidate their authority in a world where they competed openly with midwives, healers, homeopaths, the people that they termed irregulars when they were being generous, and quacks when they were not. Abortion was the issue that doctors could use to differentiate themselves as regulars who purposefully align themselves with the state and the law in order to elevate their status and become one of the arbiters of national morality and health. So in some states, they do begin, by the middle of the 19th century, late 19th century, they begin to eliminate that quickening exception or even add provisions that would specifically punish not just the abortionist or the doctor, but also the woman. I believe Wisconsin is the first state to add a clause that is going to literally go after women as well. The anti-choice reformers in today's kind of political climate over abortion have claimed that the physicians who sought to help get these laws passed in the state legislatures were doing this out of a serious commitment to fetal life. And we see that argument echoed in the Dobbs decision by Justice Alito, who assumes that this was what was driving anti-abortion laws in the past. It is true that we see some arguments from physicians like Storer, where he refers to abortion as murder, but he also lends equal weight to his outrage over women participating in the suffrage movement, refusing to fulfill the duties of mother and wifehood, and crucially, the idea that too many white middle-class women were getting abortions and allowing non-white people to, quote, as he put it, overrun the race. So the eugenic origins of abortion laws were really the key forces in criminalizing abortion, followed closely by misogyny and concern for immoral women being able to have consequence-free sex. Publicly, at least, most physicians denounced birth control and abortion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and claimed that women who artificially limited the number of children they had were violating the ethics of marriage, the laws of nature, and they were endangering the very foundation of the state, the home, as they phrased it. That's a quote from a piece in the American Journal of the American Medical Association. So it's no surprise that by 1900, every state in the Union had criminalized abortion in some form or fashion. But tellingly, and this is the key, those laws contained exceptions in every state for physicians who stated a need to perform therapeutic abortion for their patients. And it is clear that the physicians' crusade against abortion in the 19th century was done for a variety of reasons, and the moral question of abortion and questions about fetal life were not their primary reason. In addition to those state laws, abortion and birth control also became criminalized on the federal level, not because of medical pressure, but because of a kind of national obsession with obscenity. Well, I say that, but I really think it was more Anthony Comstock's personal obsession with obscenity that he just imposed on everybody else. But he was a vice reformer. He established his New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, known as the awkwardly phrase NYSSV, there we go, in 1872. And in a legal triumph against constitutional free speech, he persuaded Congress to pass the Comstock Postal Act. So this law banned the mailing of obscene, lewd, lascivious, or filthy material through the U.S. Postal Service, but it really did not explicitly define what constituted obscenity. And so over the ensuing decades, judicial interpretations of what constituted obscenity were extremely wide-ranging. They were dispensed with a wide latitude and covered basically anything having to do with sex, marriage, birth control, or abortion. And the various state bills then followed in the wake of the National Act, and they copied the federal statute, and they were known as the mini Comstock laws. And so actually the Griswold case was based on Connecticut's mini Comstock law in the future in 1965. And when I say that there was heavy punishment, I really do mean that. First-time offenders were punished with the then enormous sum of a $5,000 fine and at least 5 years in prison. So it was pretty serious if you violated the Comstock Act. Both Mary Dennett and Margaret Sanger would become targets of Comstock's zealous pursuit of obscenity and filth. They both endured trials, and for Sanger, even jail time. The cartoon pictured here from Life magazine represents Comstock's campaigns. The artist here is being arrested by Comstock for painting a presumably nude woman, even though you can't see anything. And it says, "Don't you suppose I can imagine what's under the water?" So it's important to remember that Comstock's so this is a really key point that I really like to emphasize to people. It's really important to remember that Comstock's campaign is really not just about abortion or even just birth control. This is a crucial distinction because it tells us that abortion did not carry the disproportionate weight in thinking about what constituted a crime of obscenity. He's just as obsessed with pornography, for example, as he is abortion. So, nevertheless, because of the messy patchwork of abortion laws at both the federal and state level, what this did mean is that abortion ends up getting policed, but it gets policed irregularly, and it results in frequently conflicting local court decisions. Further, women continue to seek them out for unwanted pregnancies, and research suggests that they sought abortions at consistent rates both before and after the passage of these state and federal statutes. As scientific medicine gradually gained a foothold in American society, more women sought abortions from licensed practitioners, even though the practice was still illegal. But the most desperate, those who could not access a clinician, qualified or otherwise, or who could not afford it, performed self-induced abortions. So women used sharp objects such as knitting needles, hairpins, crochet hooks, pencils, catheters, or other instruments, and even Clorox and turpentine, and not surprisingly suffered from complications such as perforations of the uterus, septic infections, which were often fatal. And there were abortion wards in many major hospitals around the country, especially think about Chicago. Cook County Hospital had an entire ward devoted to septic abortion patients, and they only closed after the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down. So we have it's difficult to know though how many women actually died of abortions gone wrong in this century period that we're talking about. We have some statistics from the 1930s because there was a physician named Frederick Taussig who wrote a book called Abortions, Spontaneous and Induced Medical and Social Aspects, actually published in St. Louis just down the road in 1936. And he estimated that there were probably somewhere around 681,000 abortions per year based on his census calculations, and that roughly at least somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 women out of that died. But by that period, though, he's saying by the 1930s, the methods have actually gotten safer, so this number is lower than it would have been in prior decades. So by the early 20th century, most physicians were actually chafing at the harsh laws that they had helped pass, their prior generation had helped pass, even with the life and health exceptions that were included in state level abortion laws. And it made them subject to a level of legal scrutiny that they argued prevented them from practicing their profession as they saw fit. Indeed, although it has been charged as a bad decision, even from abortion supporters, Roe v. Wade merely returned the full power of decision-making to medicine regarding abortion, and it really reflected the kind of pre-19th century acceptance of abortion before quickening. It also echoed the long-standing legal acceptance of physicians being able to prescribe birth control for their patients, even though birth control was also criminalized for the general public. So, and again, since that precedent is set from that 1936 Japanese pessaries case, where the court had decided that physicians' professional rights embrace the right to prescribe contraceptives for medical reasons. And that decision would contribute to an increase in the establishment of birth control clinics across the United States beginning in the early 1940s, and it would expand access to contraceptives for some patients. But by the time Justice Blackmun authored the opinion in the Roe case, doctors had really been freed for about 40 years to preside over the health and morality of their patients, cultivating their role as the self-appointed arbiters of marital and family health. So where does contraception then fit into all of this? Legalizing contraception for physicians and for the reformers seemed to be the solution that would solve the problem of abortion, right? This is where Dennett and Sanger's stories begin in terms of their involvement with the movement and their swiftly fracturing relationship with each other. So born in 1879, Margaret Sanger was one of 11 children. She was educated at both Catholic and private boarding schools. She eventually turned toward nursing training, and she graduated from the White Plains Hospital program outside of New York City. She married in 1902 to William Sanger, and she raised 3 young children and entertained some of the luminaries of socialist politics at their home. Sanger joined the Industrial Workers of the World as a strike organizer and began teaching herself about contraceptive techniques. At that time, nursing school offered almost no training in contraceptives. In the socialist movement, however, ideas about birth control and family limitation were increasingly discussed. Women who supported labor rights and socialist ideals began to agitate for more sexual freedom in society. Even as mainstream socialists were hesitant to lend their support, these women argued that without birth control, free childcare, and support for their financial support for families, the working class would never be successful in improving social conditions. So Sanger picks up this language. She advocates for women's first freedom as the right to control her own body. And she repeatedly states that birth control was the solution to abortion and that abortion was immoral. She wrote in her pamphlet, Family Limitation, that, quote, any attempt to interfere with the development of the fertilized ovum is called an abortion. No one can doubt that there are times when an abortion is justifiable, but they will, quote, become unnecessary when care is taken to prevent conception. This is the only cure for abortions. Yet her advocacy drew the ire of Comstock-approved post office officials. She evaded arrest by traveling to Europe, where she visited physician experts and various birth control clinics before returning to New York in 1916. It was that same year that she opened a birth control clinic in Brownsville, located in Brooklyn, where mostly Jewish and Italian families lived. On its first day, the clinic served more than 100 women, and I do have a picture up here of the women waiting in line, and I believe it's also on the poster for today's talk. She was arrested at least twice, if I'm remembering correctly, for operating this clinic. She stands trial in January of 1917. She lands in prison for 30 days. By 1921, she's decided that avoiding getting arrested is actually what she should be focusing on. And she founds the American Birth Control League to further her goals in the movement. And by the middle of the 1920s, she's really kind of toned down some of those more radical tactics in favor of basically wooing physicians and eugenicists. She wants that support for the movement. She, in particular, lobbies for what was called the Doctors Only Bill. Rather than lobbying Congress for an outright repeal of contraception from the Comstock Act, it gets named in the Comstock Act, and so there were other supporters who said, why don't we just take that out of the Comstock Act? She says, actually, we should just have a bill that we propose that says only physicians can prescribe contraception. So she and the ABCL, the American Birth Control League, draw up proposed legislation that will amend the law and not to allow the free distribution of birth control, kind of like how it was happening, right? Because you could just go down to the drugstore and buy it, but instead only allow physicians to prescribe it. This doctors only bill firmly aligned birth control not with obscenity, but with the benefits of better public health and medical expertise. So physicians who supported birth control were excited about this because they wanted to control its dissemination. So people like Dr. Robert Dickinson, who was a pioneer of sterilization surgery and head of New York's Committee on Maternal Health, explained that while the work of birth control was constructive, that physicians should, quote, collaborate with school and church and school and college in exalting marriage and monogamy. Instead of sidestepping, we will share and lead. So he aimed to convince medical doctors that they should maintain ultimate control of contraceptive devices and information, and that would strengthen heterosexual marriage and therefore the state itself. Sanger grounded her legal and moral position about medicalizing birth control in the idea that an open market for contraception would hurt women and leave them at the mercy of unscrupulous contraceptive distributors whose products were ineffective or dangerous. As she later explained in her autobiography, no one has sufficient knowledge of the possible consequences of some contraceptives. So to permit them to be manufactured or distributed without guidance or direction, it might kill the birth control movement as well as some of the women who have used them. So I want to highlight here, although historians and of course the public tend to view Sanger kind of more as an activist, as I mentioned, she was a trained nurse. So given the debate that I'm discussing today, I really want to suggest that we should view her here as part of the medical establishment and not separate from it. And this reconsideration, I think, of Sanger helps us to really better understand the core of her debate with Dennett and its consequences, because her position is the one that has endured until today, right? Now birth control is considered a crucial part of formal reproductive medicine. It's obtained through a physician's prescription. And yet we know that the development of the birth control pill, IUDs, and other hormonal treatments for controlling reproduction often have very problematic origin stories in the longer narrative of the history of women's health and minority health in the United States. So we can think about the racist and colonialist history of running the first birth control trials in Puerto Rico, the protest in the 1960s and 1970s by the feminist women's health movement against patriarchal medicine, and the related congressional pill hearings in 1970, to name just a few examples. All of those things speak to the complicated history of the collisions between race, gender, medicine, and public health in the 20th century. And we can trace much of that backstory, I'm arguing, to the medical and legal politics of the birth control movement in the 1920s and the process by which birth control became part of the medical establishment. Further, that history becomes especially salient when we consider how in the early days of the movement, it seemed possible for a moment that contraception would not be viewed through a medicalized lens, but rather a civil liberties lens. Mary Ware Dennett advocated for that approach. Her emphasis on framing birth control as free speech was certainly in keeping in this period with a general expansion in American civil liberties reform in this period, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But decoupling birth control from its radicalism and connecting it to medical expertise would really be the key to success in the coming decades. It was not this argument about free speech, right? But she was wary of the consequences of that change, of connecting birth control to doctors. She argued that physician control of contraception constituted a medical monopoly, where paternalistic physicians would have the sole power to decide who got to take birth control and who didn't. So she advocated that approaching birth control legalization as a right of free speech and free information instead would foster an open market where individuals and families could privately decide what was best without government or medical interference. So her approach offers us an interesting what if in understanding the framing around our current reproductive politics. Her own experiences around abortion also reinforced her ideas. Her sister Clara had an abortion at a New York hospital, unable to face having more children. Dennett wrote in her diary of visiting her sister to cheer her up. She also repeated similar arguments to Sanger about contraception being the ultimate solution to the problem of abortion. And Dennett herself knew about the consequences of unwanted and dangerous pregnancies. She was born in April of 1872. She originally wanted to be an artist. She was actually a well-known member of the arts and crafts movement. She revived an ancient Spanish technique of leatherwork that dates from the Middle Ages. So actually, if she hadn't become a birth control activist, we might have been talking about Mary Ware Dennett as a very famous artist. She married a fellow design enthusiast and an architect named Hartley Dennett in 1900. Their marriage was this model of professional and personal partnership. She got pregnant almost right away with their first son, Carlton, but it was an arduous labor that nearly killed her. In 1903, she became pregnant with another son named Appleton, who died only after 3 weeks. And she finally bore another son in 1905, Devin, who survived, who ended up pictured here in this wonderful Christmas card from the Dennett singing Little Merry Christmas, 1913, I think. I can't remember the exact date. After the third pregnancy, however, Devin's, she was severely ill for 2 years because she had an internal vaginal tear that was going to require surgery. And at that point, her physician said she and her husband had to be abstinent because another child would kill her. But as usual for the era, the doctor refused to give him any birth control advice. So Dennett would later write to friend and fellow birth control advocate Mary Stopes, "I was utterly ignorant of the control of conception, as was my husband also. We had never had anything like normal relations, having approximated almost complete abstinence in the endeavor to space our babies, both wanted, but both accidental." Dennett would later implicate the lack of available legal contraceptive knowledge for both her own illness and her resulting marital troubles. After Devin's birth, her relationship with her husband deteriorated significantly, and she blamed the lack of sex, and so did he. His eye kind of wandered. He ends up having an affair with one of his architecture clients, actually. And their 1913 divorce would basically be laid bare in the papers. It was recounted all over the country in papers like the Detroit Journal and the Boston Globe. And those experiences really kind of shaped what would come afterwards. She had very little patience with male chauvinism, either in husbands or in doctors. So as her marriage disintegrated, she relocated to New York City with her sons. She threw herself into suffrage reform. She was the literature coordinator for the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, until 1915. And she also joined this club called Heterodoxy, which was a group for women living in Greenwich Village, where they got to hear speakers talk on all kinds of controversial topics, and probably where she heard Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger speak on birth control. But then Sanger flees to Europe, and Dennett kind of seizes the moment to found the National Birth Control League. So she founds this group on March 31st, 1915, along with friends from the suffrage movement at her friend Clara Stillman's home in New York City. And from the start, we can see the NBCL, which turned into what was known as the Voluntary Parenthood League. They kind of reformatted themselves after a couple of years. They really frame this as doctors have a responsibility to give their patients proper contraceptive information, and that only the law prevents them from doing so. It also emphasized that parents should be the one to use birth control without interference. An early league pamphlet stated, "We believe the question as to whether or not and when a woman should have a child is not a question for physicians to decide, except when the woman's life is endangered, but a question for the individual family to decide." So as I discuss in chapter 4 of my book, several years after the founding of the NBCL/VPL, Dennett's worst fears about the American medical establishment were realized when she attempted to court the NYAM's member physicians for support of a straight repeal of the birth control clause from the Comstock Act, the federal one. Dennett knew, despite her distrust of physicians, she really felt that she couldn't make much headway without physician support. But the encounter was really inauspicious from the start. In March of 1920, she attended a meeting at the Academy's Public Health Committee where she had a 15-minute hearing to explain her case. So you have to imagine this little lady coming before this like board of white male physicians all staring her down who are not happy that she's there. They're very hostile. 5 of the minutes were absorbed by the committee chairman's railing against the cause of birth control in general. So it was not, she pressed onward, however, and she later, after her speech to them, she would go on to send literature to them. But by April 6th, a subcommittee consisting of 5 physicians had countered with their own suggestion for amending the Comstock law, writing to the Voluntary Parenthood League that they did not approve of the amendment as written, and they would only recommend a set of phrases that would amend the law to say that nothing in the obscenity law shall apply to duly licensed physicians in connection with the discharge of their respective duties in protecting the health of patients and of the community. In other words, birth control was to remain obscene for everybody else, except doctors. And that was just as what Sanger had been advertising. So Dennett tried to get the larger committee on public health to reconsider. She wrote to them saying, "I understand your position. I understand that you want to preserve the public from unsafe or harmful contraceptive methods, but a doctor's only rule really doesn't make any sense from a practical sense because legal restrictions still exist. And the first step is that we have to remove birth control from the obscenity clause. The doctor's bill would simply continue to associate birth control," she argued, "with illicit sex rather than a practicality and a necessity." So throughout the summer of 1920, she continues to work broad physician support. She begins planning this conference. She invites a bunch of doctors to it at New York's Colony Club. She was as conciliatory as possible. She was trying to appeal to their sense of professional public importance and expertise. But her correspondence with the Academy basically reveals an increasingly intractable disagreement over the proposed amendment, as well as a deep reluctance by many of these physicians to be associated with the VPL at all. By January, she was writing to the VPL supporters saying, she called this whole set of incidents an uncomfortable episode. And she stated that the physicians continually misinterpreted my letters. They were reading into my statements ideas that were not there. And it really illustrates this particular incident. It illustrates the first steps in how medical power and professionalization came to control birth control's narrative strategy in the coming years. So Margaret Sanger, indeed, is the one that kind of, again, picks up that narrative strategy, right? And she is the one that we can credit for really developing it into a highly organized movement that carries forward, up through the middle of the 20th century, eugenics became the key on which Sanger kind of hung her hat. The idea was with eugenics that it was first proposed, it's a scientific theory first proposed in the 1870s. It's related to Darwinism and natural selection. It posits that humans, like animals, could be bred for better health. And it was a science that was taken very seriously. Now we hear the word eugenics and we're like, oh, quack science, bad, but to people who were working with this in the early 20th century, this was the highest level of scientific development. It was taught in biology classrooms. It basically gave an answer to everything. It seemed to justify from generally improving health and environmental conditions to obviously defending sterilization and euthanasia of the disabled and the unfit. The ABCL published a magazine every month called the Birth Control Review, and it essentially took to eugenic ideas to connect them to birth control and say, birth control is how we're going to implement eugenics in America. While interested in eugenics, Dennett was wary of linking birth control with eugenic thinking, and she told one correspondent that the two issues should be entirely separate, they should not be jumbled, they're far from synonymous, and she told somebody else that basically if you connect birth control with eugenics, you're basically saying the control of the unfit is a simple birth control problem when this is actually a form of governmental interference into people's private lives, and that's what she wanted to stay away from, right? That tracks. So meanwhile, Sanger is extremely successful in this strategy. She's the one that helps turn this into actual action on the ground by helping to found many clinics around the country. But it is important to note that her embrace of eugenic thinking and it's not her embrace of eugenic thinking and the proliferation of new and shiny birth control clinics, that was not really the key to convincing physicians that they should be in charge of this stuff. Because first of all, eugenics and birth control, despite Sanger's insistence on this, they were not synonymous in the 20s and 30s. The eugenics movement had the backing of universities and scientific agendas. It was part of a national conversation on the health and future of American power and national superiority. Birth control, by contrast, is controversial. It smacks of sex and immorality. Few eugenicists wanted to claim Margaret Sanger. But by connecting birth control and eugenics together, it helps to legitimize the birth control movement, and that's what Sanger understood. As for clinics, it is true that they did much of the hard work of distributing birth control on the ground, especially to low-income women, fitting them for pessaries and diaphragms or providing low-cost solutions that didn't require a pelvic exam, such as spermicidal foam or jellies. Raids on birth control clinics happened because they were distributing information in person and as well as through the mail. But other than that, local police forces would often leave the clinics alone because they felt like they were doing a public health service. Nevertheless, many physicians and Americans saw clinics as suspect. Accusations were rife, and they were run by lay people who knew nothing about medicine, or at best incompetent doctors who otherwise couldn't succeed in private practice. Birth control reform really only made headway when we see the law come into play. It made the most headway when white male physicians were touting the need for their need to exercise their professional expertise without fear of legal consequence. So this is where that Japanese pessaries case comes into play. The one package affair was a test of the constitutionality of the 1873 Comstock Act, as well as the more recent 1930 Tariff Act, both of which specifically banned the importation, sale, or distribution of contraceptive information and devices. So Sanger and the civil liberties attorney Lawrence Ernst, who's pictured here, he had also defended her during her clinic arrests back in the 20s. They realized that in order to gain the medical profession's endorsement of birth control, that they would have to really work even through the courts to remove that association with immorality and instead connect it to medical expertise. And so when they win this case, it's considered a huge victory for the medical profession. On December 7th, 1936, Judge August Hand upholds the decision of the lower court, arguing that the Comstock Act's design was not to prevent the full medical practice of, quote, conscientious and competent physicians. And it appears to be this total victory, and they trumpet it as the law of the land in the birth control review. And they say things like, a new era of Planned Parenthood has begun. And so 1 year later, actually, the American Medical Association officially endorsed birth control, which was a huge step forward because they had refused to do that until this particular case. In the wake of the one package decision, doctors more freely prescribed contraceptives to their private patients. So here is pictured Alan Guttmacher, who would be one of the presidents of Planned Parenthood. He did a study in 1947 of 15,000 physicians, including all the licensed practicing OBGYNs in the United States. And of the some 3,300 returned and completed surveys, his study found that 68% of physicians approved of contraceptive advice being given to any married woman who requested it. Fewer than 2.5 disapproved of contraception regardless of cause. And so the one package decision is really the legal mechanism by which we can recognize medicalized contraception, and it was done under the auspices of Sanger and other reformers' consistent efforts to hammer away at the Comstock laws, not via legislative change or from the perspective of free speech, but from the angle of privacy and medical expertise. One public birth control program established in North Carolina in 1938 illustrates how this law would play out on the ground, and also how the forces of racial discrimination, paternalism, and medicine came to operate in the movement. Speaking to Demmett's fears of what would happen when and if physician and paternalism and race-based and eugenic thinking were birth control's primary motivators. So Dr. Clarence Gamble, pictured here, he was a Harvard Medical School graduate, and like I said before, heir to the Procter & Gamble fortune. He established the North Carolina program, and he basically was a one-man band with this. He was financing this. He was the one kind of tracking the study. He works with North Carolina health officials to personally fund and administer for an entire year the distribution and testing of a foam powder contraceptive that he had personally developed. And he was saying, this is great because it can be distributed cheaply. He touted it actually doesn't have to be dispensed by physicians at all, and it's easy to use. And he was especially proud of what he said would be a positive impact on the state's poor Black population and encourage them to have fewer babies. He noted, as a eugenicist, decrease in population is not a thing to be worried about, but decrease in the more intelligent level of the population, it is, and it is my belief that contraception as a public health measure will tend to correct the present unfortunate differential birth rate. And you can see from his notes that he really believed that here he has written a family living in Wake County, North Carolina, 15 children, 12 living, 3 dead, 2-room shack welfare case. And these are the kind of notes that he was taking, using to justify the distribution of this foam powder. But the foam powder didn't work. Both clinic field workers and patients protested once its inefficacy became clear. Further, he withdrew his funding in 1940, and contraceptive distribution and clinic operation continued only on a county-by-county basis, depending on local officials. But the existence of this program illustrates just how much had changed in basically the 40 years between Demmett battling the physicians of the New York Academy of Medicine almost 20 years earlier, and in the meantime, how white physicians had wrested the control of the movement and put birth control into the domain of medicine. In general, men dominated birth control reform at that point, to the point where the women who had started the movement were deliberately excluded from new initiatives, except as lower-level functionaries or nurses. Indeed, Dr. George Cooper, who was the state director of the North Carolina Division of Maternity and Infancy, was explicit that this particular program had absolutely nothing to do with Margaret Sanger. He explained, she didn't have a dad-blame thing to do with it, and we don't want any part of Margaret Sanger's advertising and controversy. At the national level, men were being hired to head birth control organizations, and only male doctors were then considered for the medical director positions. This North Carolina program was also a harbinger of the future trajectory of birth control programming when it came to the African American community. By the late 1930s, early 1940s, the newly termed Planned Parenthood, which was the heir to the ABCL, had launched a contraceptive campaign titled Better Health for 13 Million. It was aimed at Black Americans. The patients who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of the program were, again, at the mercy of white reformers and physicians who repeatedly changed their minds about these services and terminated financial support for any and all reasons that you could think of. So although Black doctors and health professionals sought to help lead this program, white leaders at Planned Parenthood and white physicians did not invest appropriate resources into making it a truly biracial coalition. And Black patients, while certainly not uninterested in birth control, rightly distrusted a white-led medical establishment where they encountered racist and paternalistic attitudes. But you can see here from the sources that I have here on the page, we know that the Black community was intensely interested in birth control and what it could do for what they termed racial uplift. So you can, and Black newspaper editors, Black churches, were all talking about the uses of birth control. The problem was that this separate programming further marginalized African American communities, and it perpetuated the inequalities in medical education, training, funding, development in all areas of human health, and made Black women's reproductive health a secondary cause. So we are really feeling, I know, wrap this up, I know we're all hot because there's a lot of people in this room, or maybe it's just me, I don't know. We continue to feel the ramifications of all of these historical choices and trajectories in the US. We struggle to define birth control and relatedly abortion as sound medical practice. Healthcare in minority communities continues to be marginalized, and African American maternal health rates are at a crisis point. Birth control funding and programming at the federal and state levels is at the whim of political agendas that continue to employ moral framings about race and class. And now the Dobbs decision, which has now effectively struck down the legal right to abortion, but also threatens birth control, as Justice Clarence Thomas suggested, should be reevaluated in his concurring opinion on Dobbs, looms. Thomas was referring to the Griswold case, the case that legalized birth control for married couples in 1965. This is the case in which the majority opinion in Roe would later draw upon for precedent. It challenged one of the Little Comstock laws that banned contraception in the state of Connecticut, and it established the right of marital privacy and to use birth control in consultation with their doctor. So it is telling that as this case wended its way up to the Supreme Court, the lower court was more convinced by the rationale of doctor expertise than they were the marriage argument. The court noted, is a doctor to be prosecuted as a criminal for doing something that is sound and right in the best tenets and traditions of a high calling dedicated and devoted to health? So Roe followed that reasoning about doctor expertise when Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe, pictured up here on the left, first sought to challenge Texas's abortion law in 1969. Women's legal status in the United States was still at best undefined, and there had been only modest legal progress for women's rights past the 19th Amendment. Even as the feminist movement gained traction in the 60s, women's rights within marriage, at work, and in the broader polity remained radically incomplete. So it's in this context that we have to remember that that was what was informing the rationales of the 9 men who made up the court in 1973 in their decision about American women's right to an abortion. These 9 men were once again interested in returning professional rights to physicians to perform abortions if they saw fit. A century or so after physicians had led the campaign to criminalize abortion in order to professionalize, their subsequent involvement in the ensuing decades in the birth control movement had shaped new attitudes about how to maintain and grow their professional power. That would include the right to perform abortions. And it was that right that Justice Blackmun's majority opinion would cite in Roe. He wrote, the decision vindicates the right of the physician to administer medical treatment according to his professional judgment up to the points where important state interests provide compelling justifications for intervention. Up to those points, the abortion decision in all its aspects is inherently and primarily a medical decision, and basic responsibility for it must rest with the physician. He explicitly rejected a feminist framework for abortion, noting, some amici argue that the woman's right, and the appellant too, that the woman's right is absolute and that she is entitled to terminate her pregnancy at whatever time, in whatever way, and for whatever reason alone she chooses. With this, we do not agree. Blackmun's refusal to entertain feminist rationales for abortion and his understanding of the meaning of privacy mirrored the larger context of gender roles in 20th century America. In 1973, ideas about marital privacy and women's reproductive rights might have cursorily referenced feminism, but more often were still wrapped in a patriarchal cultural valence. After all, marital privacy for most of American history had meant the right of a husband who might or might not, depending on his temperament, allow his wife to make decisions on her own about her use of contraception, her health, her body, or her financial and employment matters. In the era of Roe and Griswold, the idea that birth control or abortion belonged to the private sphere as a part of a woman's decision was not inherent. In fact, it was only these cases that would forge the link more explicitly in the coming decades. Rather, the law recognized that abortion and birth control were not a woman's feminist right, but the domain of American medicine and the purview of physicians. The Roe decision marked a high point in the cultural authority of medicine, and in particular, doctors' expertise in the realm of reproductive health services. It was a trajectory that had been over a century in the making, and one that I argue in part explains how we got here to a post-Roe world. Thank you.
All right, who has questions for Dr. Thompson?
In talking about Margaret Sanger's merging of birth control with eugenics, was that tactical, or do you think she was actually heavily invested?
So in her paper, she says anything and everything. She both, I think, is invested, like many Americans were, in the science of eugenics. Eugenics was an extremely popular theory, right? I mean, you had every community in America, black and white, interested in what eugenics could do for the race. And that had a human race component, not just a racial component. On the other hand, we have writings where she says, you know, birth control should not be used to, so in one place she says it should be used to restrict the birth of the unfit. And then in another place she says that's terrible, it should not be used to restrict the birth of the unfit. So she is really all over the place. And I think that we can say that it really was very much a tactical decision. She was a very practical person with a very single-minded goal. And depending on the audience that she was talking to, she would say that what you wanted to hear. So that included speaking to, for example, women of the Ku Klux Klan, which was one of her famous talks. And she wrote afterwards that she was terrified the whole time that she was talking to them because she did not like them. And yet she was like, I don't care. We need everyone's support to legalize birth control.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering about the New Deal reformers. You didn't mention them.
Yes.
But I was struck by the fact that you did not mention that, because there seems to be a strong urge for birth control among these reformers. Eleanor Roosevelt talked about it. So does it play a role?
It does. So in my book, I talk more about progressive and New Deal reformers and their involvement and their push for birth control. But at the same time, it continues to be something that divides both progressives and New Dealers. And one of the criticisms of Mary Dennett's activism is that she was pushing for an approach to birth control that basically didn't take into account New Deal activism. She was turning away from the government at a time where other people, including Sanger, are saying, look, the government can fund this. The government can be, and the law can throw its weight behind physicians, right? And Dennett's kind of running the other way. She's kind of speaking to a sort of older understanding of civil liberties. And at the same time, though, if you look at progressive and New Deal maternal initiatives, they are running the other way from birth control. They have no interest in wanting to put federal funding toward it. In fact, the Shepherd-Towner Act, which obviously comes before the New Deal, and it's kind of a progressive triumph, right, for maternal health, they absolutely refuse to include birth control as part of their state funded programming. And Dennett and Sanger both go and give talks to try to convince the people who are lobbying for the Shepherd-Towner bill in Congress, and they don't want anything to do with it because it still has that stain, that moral stain on it that they just don't want anything to do with. And it remains that way into the 1930s, although as you can see, Clarence Gamble is kind of functioning as a sort of a New Deal experiment with public birth control programming. But that program was the first and really one of the only for a very long time of the public birth control program. So actually, in the context of the New Deal, you would think it would play a bigger role, but it really doesn't, which is strange. It is strange when you think about it.
I'm really fascinated by this narrative of the struggle around the professionalization of medicine and the power of science in a sense. And we know that the 20th century is about this and giving more and more power into science, particularly the 50s and the 60s where we end up. So if we are taking this narrative up through Dobbs, why is it that now we are willing and actually all accept the removal of this expertise and power in the hands of the doctors?
Right. So why, in other words, why are we willing to tolerate the removal?
Not only just tolerate, but celebrate.
Right. Right. Well, I think the American medical profession, from what I've been watching the statements of the AMA.
Yeah, they're not dancing.
They are not willing to accept it. However, I do think that we are in this particular moment, in political moment, we're seeing again a rejection of expertise. And it's interesting because when Dennett is rejecting the physicians, it's done in a very particular social, cultural, gendered context, right? At that time, the paternalism and the patriarchy of physicians is one of the things that defined women's lack of citizenship status, right? Like it was the argument that women could not physically or mentally handle citizenship was coming from physicians. I think over the course of the 20th century, she dies in 1947, she never lets go of pushing back against that narrative, and the suffragists, of course, pushed actively back against that narrative. You know, women are not crazy, we deserve the vote, da, 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 da. But now I think, and I'm just spitballing about this, but I think if we look back at the late 60s and the 70s and the return to kind of home and the rejection of, for a long time, like women actually did want medical intervention into their pregnancies and in the realm of birth control because childbirth was so dangerous, women's health was so precarious. But we get this rejection of it by the 60s, 70s, 80s. And I think we're sort of reaping that now because there is a much more widespread rejection of expertise and facts and things like that. And I think that might be where we can locate some of what you're saying.
So you're not locating it in the fusion of the rise of sort of the post-Nixon conservative.
Well, I think that plays a role, right? Because I think if we look at the development of the post-Nixon conservatism, the abortion, anti-abortion movement cements in the 70s and 80s because it's linked not just to race and civil rights, but also a reaction to vastly changing gender roles, the activism around the Equal Rights Amendment. It's like a pie. You have to divide that pie in half to understand where anti-abortion activism came from. And so I think it located within that pie is certainly a rejection of the liberal establishment, the idea that we have to look at expertise and facts and data to make our decisions about these things.
Dennett lost twice.
Yes, yes, and it's funny because there is such a big debate in this country about free speech and free expression, and especially in the 20s when she's latching onto this. The ACLU is brand new. It is taking on these like post-World War I like Red Scare cases. It's she's right in there with all of that, and she was really good friends with many of the ACLU founders. She's on the board, I think, she does all kinds of things with the ACLU. And the ACLU, of course, grows in significance, and yet we are continuing to have debates today over that the ACLU is mediating, right? And it's a constantly shifting line in the sand.
Well, first off, thanks for the presentation. It was great. I'm from Chile, so like I don't know a lot about, you know, the women's like suffrage and abortion movement here in the US. At the beginning of the presentation, you started talking about how the struggle for abortion has been a cyclical process of historical steps forward and then steps backward. And from what I gathered from the presentation, a lot of it has had to do with conflicts within the medical field, the scientific field, and our relationship with what I think maybe from what I understood was not as prevalent as it is now, I think, was the aspect of religion.
Yeah.
So would you say that that is a new phenomena, or maybe was that just sort of like under the covers before and just building up, or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Catholicism obviously had a huge anti-abortion and anti-birth control presence. In fact, I think we can't overestimate the anti-abortion movement that really kind of takes off in the 70s and 80s really does have its roots in Catholic activism and then Catholic alliance with Protestantism. You find that Protestants and Catholics, especially in the Midwest and West, begin to have this uneasy alliance with each other after decades and decades of hating each other. Yes, and they begin to align on the abortion question because both the race and gender questions that are animating the 60s and 70s bring them together in this kind of uneasy truce. But I would actually say that the religious piece of it is less prominent than you might think, so Catholics are pretty consistent, but in the Protestant denominations, you actually have, again, a kind of mixed record. Some ministers tell their congregations that family planning is part of making that healthy family, making the state stronger. So birth control is actually something that God wants you to practice. And you have others who are saying it's evil, don't do it. They're echoing Catholic arguments. What they do turn to, both Catholics and Protestants, is eugenics. And they both align with eugenic arguments about the health and strength of the family. And so sometimes that includes using birth control, but other times it does not. So it's hard to make a definitive statement and say, yes, religion played an enormous role in this period. And it's also hard to say, oh, it played no role at all. So as usual with historical questions, it lies somewhere in the middle. Yeah, but that's a good thing.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Lauren, thank you for a wonderful talk, and you do a really good job of showing a path not taken. So I'm curious if you can relate that to another path not taken, which is the reasoning used in Roe itself. So as you know very well, a lot of legal scholars and activists have been frustrated since the ruling was issued that it rooted it in a right to privacy rather than equal protection.
Right.
How would you compare that alternative to what it seems to me is a very different, a third alternative that Dennett was proposing, rooting it in civil liberties?
Civil liberties,
And what it might, how does that compare to the equal protection argument? And I'm especially, an invitation, as you just mentioned, to talk about what could have happened in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s as Holmes and Brandeis and other justices were starting to take a more robust understanding of free speech seriously in that regard.
Right.
What could have happened to some of these issues if they were not put in the equality frame, but in the liberty frame, which is very different than the privacy frame.
Right, very different, right. So I think it goes back to how they were understanding privacy at the time. And again, I think I maintain the idea that privacy in the Roe decision, again, it meant privacy between a doctor and the patient, but really just mostly the doctor to make a private decision, maybe with consulting the patient. maybe not. Because privacy for women in the 19th century, I mean, certainly we have cases where we begin to see the emergence of like the right to be let alone, and there are cases in the late 19th century, early 20th century where we begin to see the development of right of privacy covering bodily privacy, like the right not to be touched, attacked, and so forth, particularly male on female violence. And yet, I think you're right, that it is such an interesting question to think about, well, what would happen if, so because there is a hugely expanding regime in terms of the freedom of civil liberties in the 30s and 40s, and we get expanding definitions of pornography. Dennett has a whole other like side career as a sex educator, and she writes this book. I just totally left this out because I really couldn't talk for like 4 hours to you guys. She wrote a book called The Sex Side of Life. It gets her arrested. She is like a grandmother by the time she's going through this trial, and so she has a lot of public sympathy. And in that case, the judge, also August Hand, by the way, the same person who decided the one package case, it's also a district level case. And he says like, oh my God, this is like ridiculous. Like the book is sound medical science, and you know, all children should read this book. Everybody needs to have, you know, good sex education so that we have a better morality and so on and so forth. And so, you know, there is this expanding regime where there's a moment where it seems like birth control, and in fact, in early birth control cases, especially dealing with Sanger, when Sanger's on trial, there are moments where her lawyer is making these arguments about women's rights and bodily freedom and privacy, and yet they just keep getting tracked on this path toward doctors' expertise, and it's like you cannot get it off this train track, and Dennett cannot do it. She just can't, even in her own case, like you would think that would expand understandings of the role of birth control and abortion. And it does, because it helps, I think, normalize birth control for Americans, but it still doesn't ever put it to a, you know, we move away from that open market of contraception where you can just, I mean, in some ways, yes, condoms in CVS today, right? But or Plan B, I guess, although that's increasingly under attack, and that we do not know where that is going to go now, right? And so I think that the right to privacy becomes this, you know, this stake in Roe on which people are like, it's the thing that makes people upset about Roe, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can really definitively say what would have happened if there had been another case that suddenly decided that birth control was legal on the grounds of free speech. But I do think that if Dennett's arguments had been taken more seriously, if the context had somehow shifted, then, you know, possibly I wouldn't be giving the same talk today. And that's what's interesting to me. And I think that did not whatsoever answer your question, but, but I can try more at dinner. Yeah.
Good answer.
I'm glad religion was mentioned, but I don't want to compare churches to tax corporations. So sure, some people would be fine with that. With the rise of super PACs and outside corporate influence in elections, and even open corporate influence on public matters like Black Lives Matter and things like that, I was wondering if there was any corporate influence and how much money was rolling in, especially with maybe more so on the medical side with the rise of private insurance in kind of the 20s and beyond.
Yeah.
So how did corporations play in, and then how did their money influence this movement?
Such a good question. So corporations who produce contraceptives continue to basically skirt that line between medical device and contraceptive by using euphemistic language. But they are the ones who are consistently arguing that these items are subject to, you know, free distribution under, you know, capitalism. And so they're the ones, they have this very strange role in the birth control movement where they're giving money sometimes to Sanger and the ABCL. By the way, like Dennett refused to run their advertisements because she didn't want to like taint her free speech, free expression, constitutional, you know, path. But Sanger actually printed advertisements from these companies. She took their money, and that actually was a point of contention between her and Dennett, because Dennett said, I thought you said that these things were dangerous. Like, why are you printing their advertising in your newspaper? And it was subject to a series of nasty back and forth between the two of them in their papers. But yeah, I mean, I think increasingly, especially as we get to the development of the pill, you begin to see an increasing role of the pharmaceutical industry in attempting to sway physicians that, but again, they're directing their marketing toward doctors because they know that's who's in charge of giving this stuff out. So they are not lobbying, the other way because they want to sell their products, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for the talk. I had not wrapped my brain around the role of the medicalization of this field before, so super illuminating. One thing, and this is kind of a crystal ball gazing question, given what you understand about what's happened in the past. So I wonder if there's a view about what's going to happen now related to the open democratization of access to this kind of technology going forward. So you have open states legalizing provision of abortion by alternative healthcare providers that are not physicians.
Right.
You have self-managed abortion access happening overseas, in addition to in some black market states in our country. There are companies trying to bring the birth control pill over the counter right now, engaging with the FDA. And I just wonder, what are the accelerators if you were to see patterns from before to today that could make that access expand exponentially in the face of the fact that there's now a necessity because it's been taken away from so many physicians' hands?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to absolutely see the rise in self-managed abortions, and probably much of it is going to rely on medication abortion. I'll argue that misoprostol and mifepristone, given the fact that the FDA has just, when was that? I think in the fall, they've said, we're going to let this be distributed without a physician appointment. And now, of course, that's the next frontier of anti-choice state legislators, because they do not want people accessing medication abortion. And I think it's going to be a very interesting battleground, because are we going to see the revival of things like the Comstock laws? Are we going to start criminalizing the mails? Are you going to get your letters or your emails opened by officials, coming out of these new regulations that are going to be looking for certain words? We already saw a case in, I think, Virginia, where a mom and her daughter have been arrested because they looked through their Facebook messages, right? So increasingly, this is an unknown. I mean, I think the past can tell us something, but we also don't know where this is going to go, because we're not certain how. I mean, think about the harbinger of elections like Kansas. What is going to happen in November? We just don't know. And the early numbers are telling us that women voters are registering in record numbers, and it's now as opposed to, but that you can tell something's on the verge of tipping one way or the other, but I just don't know which way it's going to go. But I certainly know that medical abortion is the next target.
Probably just do two more or something.
Okay, how about those two?
Once again, I am very grateful that you came and talked to us. I was really interested in your inclusion of race as a role in this. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on what the role of African American women was in this movement? Were there segregated groups away from the American Birth Control League? If so, did they have their own journals that they wrote for? Did they really work together at all?
They did. Yeah, that is such a good question. So the answer is yes to all of that. There were some groups that emerged that were specifically run by African Americans for African Americans. For example, with the help of the APCL, they started a clinic in Harlem. This is in the late 20s, early 30s. But the American Birth Control League also did have Black workers, healthcare workers, administrators. In fact, one of the, again, Sanger being such an enigma and all over the place, we actually have a letter from her where she's writing to one white ABCL administrator, chastising that person for treating a fellow Black staff member in a racist way. And she says, that has no place here. What are you doing? So it's very, there are efforts at inclusion, but they never go far enough. They're incomplete. And by the middle of the 20th century, obviously the reach just never gets far enough, because think about things like the Mississippi Freedom, or the Health Project, sorry, and you have Black women going into Mississippi who are not necessarily even nurses, but they're, you know, going in there to do as much as they can with healthcare on the ground, and that included teaching local folks about contraception. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, and clearly the legacy of medicalization is one of the things that is still reverberating today, and is the cause of all of the issues that we have with disparities in Black maternal health.
Last question.
Right, so I have just a kind of, so two
Yeah.
sort of brief questions that I was thinking of, but so one have to do with just a bit more, it's maybe thinking through Margaret Sanger's legacy
Mhm.
and the sort of a longer kind of consequence of white abortion activists and their pursuit of a coalition politics that,
Yes.
you know, persistently there are consequences to the things that they pursue, and that kind of continues today as well. And so this piece of sort of how we think about contemporary abortion defense, right? And Ms. Sanger's like willingness to just make these coalitions that obviously, you know, most minorities will suffer from.
Mhm.
And then the second has to do with, so this is, I might not be recalling it, but it was very well, but years ago there was like a piece by Jill Lepore about the Griswold decision about Roe and privacy.
Mhm.
And, you know, whether.
I read it at the time. I read it
There
at
was-
the time, and I don't
Well, so
don't remember what she
briefly,
said.
the
Yeah.
point
Privacy
was,
and patriarchy.
yeah, exactly, but the idea was that another sort of like road not taken, if you can imagine, was pursuing a case, you know, for access to, you know, reproductive rights and abortion through equality rather than privacy.
Right.
And
Okay,
how
just-
that might have been like a more successful route to do this. I'm a bit more skeptical actually that would have worked, but I was just curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So all of those are good questions. So I mean, I think first of all, the whole aspect of Sanger and her coalition building, it's weird. She spends all this time, for example, trying to get suffragists on board, but then abandons that idea when she decides the doctors and the eugenicists are more. That's actually who she needs to be lobbying. And throughout up through the 1970s, I mean, we already know that white feminism, it makes overtures and yet never, and this is stemming from the suffrage movement, right? Like they're repeating in the 1960s, they're repeating what happened in the suffrage movement. And so I think that's where there's just this decades and decades of disconnect between white and Black feminist activists, and Black activists, you know, asks for inclusion, and then white feminists like lip service to inclusion, but then actually excluding them from the table. And I mean, I think that's the origin of the Black women's health movement, right? There's a reason why the feminist women's health movement in the 70s then has its counterpart in the Black women's health movement that comes just a little tiny bit later. So there's that piece of it. And then this art, and I'm glad you asked that because it actually makes me think about your question too, Jonathan, which this whole trying to understand whether or not maybe the equality arguments, I am also skeptical, I think. I don't know that, I mean, had Ruth Bader Ginsburg decided to litigate an abortion case, you know, that wasn't Roe on the same basis of the way that she litigated many of those other cases in the early 70s, where she achieves all these like gains for women's equality. I mean, maybe we'd be having a different conversation now, but I'm actually not convinced, because if all other things remain the same with these physicians, with the medical history aspect of it, and Alito says this himself in the decision, right? He says, oh, well, abortion's different. I mean, don't worry about any of these other things because like abortion is different, right? So like, don't worry, we're not gonna like relitigate whether women can own property, right? It's just abortion. But of course, as his counterparts on the court point out in their dissenting opinion, they're like, I think that's exactly where you're going next, right? So, and of course, Clarence Thomas just comes out and says it. And I had another law professor kind of argue with me that said, well, that's just Thomas. I mean, everyone listens to him. And I was like, yes, they do. People listen to Thomas. So yeah, that again, not probably an exact answer to what you were asking, but I think that is the origin of what we're seeing today.
So in just a few seconds, I'm going to encourage you to break into wild applause for our speaker. But before I let you all go, I want to remind you that we're going to be having a speaker come next Friday at 3:30. Rosie Zagari from George Mason is going to be giving the historian's case against the independent state legislature theory, I believe. So
That is absolutely.
Kinder continues its foray into current events. So please join us next Friday and
Historical contextualization.
Please join me in thanking our speaker, Dr.
I would say students that are over because